Somebody left this rather long and I guess a little ranty comment on my video talking about how Isaiah 7 isn't actually about Jesus, in which they complain that biblical scholars need to study more history and more archaeology. And I guess that we shouldn't just assume that biblical narratives are historically accurate. I'm not really sure what about that video in particular triggered this comment. I didn't really talk very much about history in that video. It was primarily a close literary analysis of the text, trying to get at the text apart from many of the theological assumptions that are foisted on it by more contemporary readers. I did sort of mention in passing the historical background to the story, some conflicts that took place towards the end of the 8th century BCE, the Syro-Ephraimite War, and the general geopolitical situation of having an embattled Judah in the south facing down Israel and Aram Damascus, and then Assyria coming in and doing away with that threat. Since those are the only historical things that I really touched on in that video, and the commenter, if they want to come back and correct me if this assumption is incorrect, since those are the only historical tidbits I talked about, presumably this commenter thinks that I should be more skeptical that this is an accurate reflection of the geopolitical situation at the time, that I should, not take for granted that Assyria came in and destroyed these people, or that there is tension between these, or something like that. They don't actually say. But this gives me an opportunity to talk about a rather remarkable shift that happens in access to extra-biblical evidence around the middle and especially by the late 8th century BCE. Prior to this point, for earlier historical events, extra-biblical confirmation of those events is rare. And the extra-biblical evidence that we have often contradicts biblical narratives. So if we're talking about the Exodus, for example, there is virtually no evidence for the Exodus, and the evidence we do seem to have seems to outright thwart the possibility of the biblical Exodus happening at all. Same thing with the conquest. We have no evidence for the conquest, or sparse evidence that's much better explained by alternative hypotheses, in addition to evidence that directly refutes the biblical conquest account. Same thing for the rise of the first kings in Judah and Israel, thinking here of Saul and David and Solomon. If we have any evidence at all, again, very rare, very sparse, and at least as much evidence that seems to blow big holes in the historical account that we're given in the Bible. In the 9th century, we get a couple, the Bible will say this battle happened, and then we have extra biblical evidence that the battle in fact did happen. But generally speaking, the situation in the 9th century is very similar to the situation in the 10th century. I think there are I think there's at least one or two kings who are named whose existence is confirmed in the 9th century. But once we get to the 8th century, there's a shift, a marked shift. We start getting routine confirmation of major events claimed by the Bible in extra-biblical records. And this is due in no small part to the rise and then the expansion efforts of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They are meticulous record keepers. And so we routinely get in Assyrian records references to kings in Judah, kings in Israel, the broad sort of geopolitical relationship between these things, evidence or descriptions of battles, of tribute flowing this way and that. So apropos the conflict in Isaiah 7 and 8, we do have, for example, at the Nimrud archive, we have, and inscribed on the Iran stela, we have descriptions of Tiglath-Pileser III invading northern Israel and Aram Damascus and destroying those kingdoms, destroying specific sites confirmed by archaeology with destruction layers. We have records of him imposing tribute on Judah and King Ahaz in particular. We have the archaeological confirmation of the construction of Assyrian-style administrative buildings in the region, which shows that they're taking a much more heavy-handed approach to their domination of this region. We even have, somewhat miraculously, a seal impression with the name Isaiah on it, found right next to a seal impression for Hezekiah. So the bare existence, this is not to say any of the narratives associated with them or any of the specific words associated with them, but the bare existence of a figure named Isaiah in and around the royal court by the close of the 8th century seems at least, plausible. That's what we would assume, given the evidence that we have. So in broad strokes, Now, obviously, we're never going to get extra biblical evidence of like specific lines of dialogue that take place in Isaiah 7 and 8 because an extra biblical source isn't going to have access to that. Obviously, we're not going to get extra biblical confirmation of like the internal states of character, like their desires or their motivations, because an extra biblical source, again, is not going to have access to those. Biblical authors don't even have access to those. They either inherit them by tradition or they make them up entirely to dramatize narratives that they're telling. So, as far as this point in history is concerned, and the historical background that is most relevant to the interpretation of the Emmanuel prophecy in Isaiah 7:14 and following, we actually have pretty good historical and archaeological confirmation that that picture is correct. Now, we're not going to get historical confirmation of like, the conversations that Isaiah had or that he made these prophecies, but that's also largely irrelevant to a literary analysis of the text. It just doesn't matter. It's not going to change anything about the analysis of this text and to whom it's supposed to have referred at whatever time it's written and against whatever historical backdrop it's written. It just doesn't matter all that much.